couple for each family or whatnot. Today we're going to look, in the time we have, at one controversy that pops up in the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, across both the East and the West, a controversy over the question of icons. The question of icons, the question of pictures, if you wish. Question of icons or images or pictures of God, pictures of Christ. Before we do that, though, since we're going to be heading east for a little bit, I want to give you a picture, just a 5-minute tour, if you will, of an Eastern Orthodox church. I would highly recommend, by the way, if you ever get the chance, it's always good, one day, maybe one Sunday afternoon or one weekday, to go to an Eastern Orthodox church. Also good, by the way, to go to a Mass, a Roman Catholic Mass, at some point in your life. I think it's beneficial to see how other people do things and why they do things differently. The same for, of course, a mosque or a synagogue. I've been enriched. I've seen the value of our own tradition by looking at others as well. But if you go to church, if you were going to church in Turkey or Greece or Italy, Syria, in the 9th century, in the 800s, we're talking mostly about the 800s here today, primarily. 700s too, early medieval times. But if you were to go there, it's a good time for us to talk about what you would feel, what you would see, what you would do. You would never have a pew. There would be no chairs. So you'd be standing. You'd be standing the whole time. You wouldn't have a pulpit. Even today, if you go to Russia, if you go to Greece, they have little stands like this, little lecterns they move around, but there's no pulpit. There's no pulpit. No organ, no other really musical instrument. If you ever listen to Byzantine chant, I personally enjoy it sometimes. Maybe you don't like it, but you'll realize there's no instruments. There's no really debate over it either, which may be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what you feel like. There were no statues. There are no statues. The Eastern Church distinguishes very strongly between statues, 3D representations of the saints or of Christ, which they don't allow. But there is an abundance of flat, two-dimensional images of Christ, images of Orthodox saints, images of biblical characters, Peter, Paul, and the like, which they call icons, from the Greek icon. They often have, when I went to Russia, I went to a big, famous Orthodox cathedral, and they had little candles you could buy. You can go put a candle beneath your favorite saint icon, and that saint would bless you because you paid the money, you put the icon under it. That was the theory behind it. And the idea behind the icons is that it's actually very fascinating here, and this is where I would argue the Orthodox Church really has their mark on the target that we fail to sometimes. They understand better than we do in many ways that worship on earth is worship in heaven. That when the church gathers on earth, when the saints gather on earth, we join with the worship of the angels in heaven. And that's the idea behind it. I mean, they may get it wrong, perhaps, we might say, in the icons, but their argument is, the argument back in the day, 1,000 years ago, would be that the icons are a window into the heavenly worship. If you don't think the saints and the angels are here, look at the icons. They're here. Can't you see the picture? If you doubt that you're in heaven, look at the walls around you. And that will show you, that will tell you, that'll help you understand that actually you are in company with the saints and the angels. And that with their help, you actually get to approach and worship the Trinity. Now, if you were to go in the 8th century or 9th century into an Orthodox church, you would have a kind of little screen right here. It would be pretty plain in those days. These days, there's a lot more to it. But you would have what's called the icon screen, or iconostasis. You have the icon screen. It would be separating the communion table from y'all, from the rest of the church. The best evidence we have is that this started back in the 5th century, the 400s. It would have 3 doors signifying the Trinity. The middle doors would be the holy doors, double doors. The left of the holy doors, on the left side, you have an icon of the Virgin Mary. Right side, you have an icon of Christ. And the altar, what the Orthodox call an altar, where their table would be, it's always at the east end, signifying heaven. Always at the east end to signify heaven. And only clergy alone can go behind this icon screen to the altar. Sometimes they call it the Holy Table, sometimes they call it the Throne of God. But the way they would serve communion, the way you would receive communion in the Eastern Church, to this day, for the last 1,500 years virtually, almost unchanged, the way you would do it is you would receive communion from a special spoon. The priest would have a spoon, and they would have the bread, and they would dip the bread in the wine, and they would serve this to you. The bread was ordinary leavened bread, not unleavened, that's a Catholic, baked in flat round cakes, stamped with a cross on it. Jesus Christ conquers. The wine be mixed with hot water. Those are some of the details. But what's interesting, perhaps, what's most fascinating to me when I've been to an Orthodox service is that you are all looking at me, right? It's a little bit unnerving sometimes, right? If you're a pastor and people are looking at you, you kind of get over it, I guess, after a while, like any public speaker. But in the Orthodox Church, unlike the Roman Catholic Church, unlike the Protestant Church, not everybody does the same thing at the same time. The idea that the entire congregation must do the same thing at the same time is a Western idea, largely. Within limits, you be free to participate in your own way. So when I would go to a Russian service or a Greek service, very often you'd see people just walking around, going to their favorite saint, going to the Virgin Mary, making the sign of the cross or bowing or kneeling down according to their own feeling. And at some point in the service, the priest will sense the icons. He will spread incense. He will throw incense from a special container on the icons and on the congregation. The idea is that incense is being offered to God for his presence, for his work in the saints. And you are being sensed as a Christian because you're a true icon. You're an image of God. That's a little bit of the taste of Eastern Orthodox worship. I thought I had to say some of it, at least 5 minutes about it. But as I mentioned earlier, argue if they understand that worship is eschatological, it's heaven and earth connected in a way that, we ought to. I included as well in the back here their hymns. They have great hymns, by the way. We don't know them as much, but this is from a Christmas one. We don't sing it, sadly. We ought to, but it's from a guy named Cosmos the Melodist. You can name your next child Cosmos and see how that goes well. You may like that name. Better yet, call him the Melodist, and maybe even cooler. But that was a little bit about how you would feel with the church in the 9th century. Any questions on that? I can follow up with details. Not the main topic we're going to have here today, but I wanted to give you a little flavor of what things would be like. Questions on any of that? Comments, cares, concerns? All right, so then we get into the real question here today of icons. The real question today is the great debate that occurred both in the East and in the West, in the East and the West, in the 8th century, roughly, the 9th century as well. The great controversy that almost tore apart the Christian church, almost tore apart the Eastern church. It was over icons. These are, again, pictures, not statues. Icons, pictures of Mary, of the saints, of Christ. Two-dimensional drawings, mosaics, wood, stone carvings in low relief, not three-dimensional figures. By the 8th century, icons had become widespread. People would bow down to them. People would burn candles in front of them, kiss them, pray before them. And again, the idea behind this is that an icon reveals the presence of Christ. Christ in the Virgin Mary, Christ in the saint. That as you do this, the bowing, the lamp lighting, you kiss the icon as a physical action to express your love towards Christ in the icon. You kiss the icon to express your love towards Christ in the icon. Just like a kid would kiss his mother, just like a subject would bow before the king. Now, in the 7th century, in the 8th century, there's a guy, I have his name here on your handout here, named Leo the Isaurian, from Isauria. he hated this. He declared war on this icon stuff. He was a passionate man. One writer describes him as a fierce combination of a cat and a wolf. I don't know how you get that. You can try to picture that in your mind. He had huge staring eyes, and he believed he had a personal mission from God. He was on a mission from God to cleanse the empire from this sin of worshiping icons, which would bring down divine wrath on the Eastern Church. Now, why would he do this? Of course, he could believe it, A, it's certainly a possibility. B, however, it's at this time that the great conquest of Islam occurred, the great Arab conquest. And as you may know, in Islam, it's forbidden to have any icons, certainly of the Prophet Muhammad, and generally most Muslims would say of any human representation at all. And so perhaps Leo looks at their success. He says, wow, we're losing the battle. We're obviously losing because we have these icons. That's the real problem in our life. If we get rid of them, we'll be great. Furthermore, right, so first, he probably believes it. Second, he sees the Muslims doing well. The Christians are losing. Okay. Third, he said this, I am both emperor and priest. In other words, he does what good Americans don't like. He connects the church and the state in himself. He connects the church and the state in one person, Leo. His army loves him. His army backs him. He was a general, but the monks hate him because, of course, they have the icons. They get money from the icons. They like the icons. It's their thing. They're icon people. They're monks. And also, the citizens hated him because he was taking away their worship. They love their icons. They kiss the icons. If I was to grab something that you loved and held every day, you wouldn't like it. You'd hate it. Right? So Leo tries to take out all icons. And those who followed him, I suppose these are key terms for us today, became known as iconoclast. Those who wish to break images, icon breakers. Those who liked icons. So iconoclast against the iconodules or the iconophiles. That is, icon lovers or icon venerators, those who give veneration or worship to the icons. And so in the year 726, Leo sends a squad, a platoon of his soldiers, into the palace gate. And there was a huge, gigantic golden icon of Jesus, the biggest one in the whole city. He starts the war off by having his soldiers take it down. They pull it down. You've seen statues pulled down recently in America. That's what they did to this icon. And what happened? Women came out. Angry women came out. They grabbed the sergeant in charge. They beat him to death with mops. They beat him to death with kitchen tools. They grabbed their forks, they grabbed their pans, and they killed this guy for doing it. And what did Leo do? Well, of course, he said, round up those women and kill them all, which he did. So the moral of the story is watch out with your mops, right? Don't go against a woman who has a mop. And this caused a lot of controversy. It caused a lot of controversy in an area you might not expect. It caused a lot of controversy way over in Italy. Who's in Italy at this time? The Pope, exactly. Pope Gregory. He says, no. We ain't having any of this stuff. This emperor over in the east who says he's the head of the church, no. We're not doing that. I'm the Pope. And so there's again, just by the way, one more thing to add to the growing divide between the East and the West. We've already covered the language part. Latin in the West, Greek in the East. Now we begin to have more conflicts, right? The Pope Gregory says, no, we're not having this. I'm going to support the rebels against Leo. More importantly, he actually believed, the Pope believed this time, that he should be an iconophile, that icons were great. They hadn't been as big in the West as in the East, but Pope Gregory still fought against them. Now, Leo attacked the monks. He tried to burn down their icons. Many of them fled to the West. They held their most cherished little pictures in their robes. They fled to Italy. His son continued it eventually. Theodora, an empress, around the year 842 or so, if you want to know an actual date. She rules on behalf of her son. She comes to power, and she finally, victoriously reaffirms the iconophile position. So Leo's attempt, for about 100 years, he and his son, roughly 100 years, a century of fighting against the icons, it fails. It doesn't work. Now, eventually, Theodora wins. Today, the first Sunday of Lent, the Eastern Orthodox Church celebrates this final victory in a liturgy they call the Triumph of Orthodoxy. And so today you see icons. If you talk to friends in Russia, Ukraine today, Greece, they will, if you have any Greek friends or Russian friends, they will tell you a lot about their icons, and they will have them, as some Christians have cross walls, Orthodox folks have icon walls. So, what was the debate over? Let's go through quickly four questions that popped up. It's not just about politics. It was about politics, not just about money. It was about money, not just about mops. It was about mops, but four key questions that both sides had to argue over. And I'm going to go through it because you need to know no matter where you come out on this question, it's a good thing for us to think through how did early Christians argue when they disagreed. Because guess what? If you get two Christians, if I pulled two of y'all in a room and gave you a theological question, I can guarantee that you disagree in about 5 minutes. Probably. So how did they argue? How did they debate things? And how should we? Well, first, they asked the question, do icons violate the second commandment? Second commandment forbids the making of images. Iconoclasts said, yes, they do. No man-made icons. The only proper ones are the bread and the wine, the sign of the cross, and the Chi Rho, which first two letters of Greek, the Chi Rho, right there. Now, the iconodules, the iconophiles said, hold on now. The second commandment forbids the making of false idols, false gods, pagan images, but not icons of Christ. Christ is the truth. Now look, in the Old Testament, they would say, yes, of course, you can't have images of God, but now Christ takes flesh. Now Christ takes flesh. Moreover, they said, icons are not graven images. They're not statues, right? They're not in the round, they're in the flat. This was the language they used. That's why they like 2D and not 3D. And they had to kind of, make a little exception for bas relief, minor relief pictures. They were a little up off the canvas. Moreover, they would argue that in the Old Testament you have plenty of images. You have the cherubim, you have the pomegranates and the high priest's robe, you have the palm trees, the flowers, the 12 bronze oxen, et cetera, all over the place. More importantly, they would say, look, we don't worship the icon itself. That would be idolatry. Instead, we worship not the physical thing, but the presence behind the icon. And so they would make a distinction. I suppose this is probably the important distinction to know about if you really want to know the theology. A distinction between latreia and doulia, or proskynesis, but you don't even know that long Greek word. The point is, the distinction is between worship and what they would call veneration. And they would say, we never worship, but we don't latreia these things. We don't worship these things. But we give limited secondary veneration. They said, look, this is kind of how you love your wife, husbands, and then you carry around a picture of her. Isn't the picture a good reminder? Yeah, you like the picture. You carry it around your wallet. You look it on your phone. You like the picture of her. That's all we're doing here. We're using the picture to look beyond. That was their argument. Second question here. Does the fact that Christ became incarnate mean that we should portray him as a man? The iconoclast said, no. Christ is the image of God. A person, a picture cannot reproduce the image of God. How can you picture God who is invisible? You can't do that. That's impossible. And all it can depict is half of Jesus. You get a half Jesus, the human half, not the divine half. So how can you actually say you're worshiping Jesus or you're venerating even Jesus? You're robbing him of his deity. He's a fake Jesus then. Now the Iconoclasts said on the other side of the coin, they said, hold on, Jesus became a real man. So what we're doing is we're depicting him as a real man. He's a flesh and blood guy. And so you see the debate in part is over Christology. It's not just about are pictures okay, it's about who is Jesus. The Iconoclasts would say you fail to recognize his deity. The Iconodualists would say you fail to recognize his humanity. Right? So there's a debate over that. Third, and this I think is a really key point, what is the practice of the early church? You see, this is maybe the point that I'll camp out for a second on. The Middle Ages, as I've said before, the church in the Middle Ages had to reckon with what do we do with our history? Just like you have to reckon with that. So much of our discussions are about, well, what have other people taught over the years? What have other Christians said? One of the great sins of the American church is the assumption that we don't need history. One of the great problems we have are those people, I've met them, you go out and they tell you, look, I just have the Bible. All I need is the Bible and Jesus. I don't need none of your tradition. I don't need none of your church stuff. I just got Jesus in my Bible. And of course, the easy answer to that question is, how'd you get your Bible? How'd you get your Bible in your hands? Who wrote that? Who printed it up? Do you have a publishing house yourself? Did you translate yourself? Of course, the answer is no, right? The reality is that even the Bible in our hands, even the Bible that we memorize, comes from somewhere, from somebody. Somebody published it, somebody put it on ink, somebody translated it, and the like. And so the Middle Ages church had to ask themselves the question, we have icons. Did our great-great-granddads have icons? And it's interesting, this was in some ways the best argument of the iconoclast. Until the 4th century, the fathers of the church never mentioned any theology. They didn't have anything about Christian icons. For the first 400 years of the church, they condemned pictures of Christ. They argued that the veneration of icons was a pagan practice. However, when church buildings became common in the Roman Empire in the 300s and 400s, people started to have pictures of them. Well, because they had pictures of Zeus, want to have a picture of... it makes sense. We go to our temple, a lot of pictures there. We need pictures in our church. Right? That makes sense. Now, it's interesting, by the way, that in the East, the Eastern churches tended to have Christ pictured as a human. But in the West, you see this if you do any art history work, if you go to the catacombs of Rome even, they're going to have Christ pictured as a symbol, a lamb, the Chi-Rho, the Good Shepherd, often a lamb, of course, sometimes even a fish, even a phoenix occasionally, a pelican, but we're getting off. Now, the Iconoclasts had a big problem here. If you like icons, but you know the early church didn't like icons, what do? What they did is they began to appeal to the idea of an unwritten tradition within the church. They began to say, look, there's this unwritten tradition within the church that has generally accepted the idea of icons. Well, maybe we'll return to that in a couple of seconds. The last argument they had, what's best for those people who can't read? If you're not literate, if you're uneducated, you can't read, what do? Now, you may know the rate of literacy in the Roman Empire at its height was about 30%. That's what we determined. Most people could not read, therefore. That was true, of course, even more so in the Middle Ages. So what do you do with that? The iconoclast said, look, if you have pictures, you have icons, you're going to worship the icon. You're going to be illiterate, so you're going to make the mistake. You're not going to be so fancy as to make the distinction between veneration and worship. You're just going to assume you're going to worship it. The Iconoclasts said, no. These are like books. These pictures are like books for the people who can't read, for the illiterate. John Damascus says, what the written word is to those who can read, the icon is to the illiterate. What speech is to the ear, the icon is to the eye. And so you have these questions. I'm not going to answer. We did a whole thing on the second commandment a couple of years ago. I'm not going to get into what should be our position. We can talk about that at a different time. My point here is simply to elaborate to you the way they argued, what they argued, the kind of methods they used, and really, I hope you see the way that Christians argued in the Middle Ages is not that different from the way you and I argue. If there's one kind of point that I want to draw out here, it's that the kind of questions they asked, even though they may worship very differently than you and I in some ways, they're still Christians. They still talked about things in the way that you and I will talk. They still debated these questions. Second commandment, incarnation. What has history taught us in the early church? And they asked the practical question, what about people who don't know anything? People who can't read? So they put together theology, the Bible, history, and practical questions. Very, very smart people, very intelligent. Any questions on any of that? We're coming to a close. I will hit Theodulf for a second here. But any questions before we go west for a second? That's very true, Jim. That's very true. There might be reasons for that. Yes, we don't. You do see a cross, of course. So let's go west for a little bit. Let's meet a guy. If you want a name for your second child after Cosmos, here's one. Theodulf. Theodulf. These are all guy names. I'm sorry. You can. The girl name is Theodora. There you go. I gave you more names. You're welcome. So Theodulf, his years 750, 821. He's Spanish. He's from Spain. He connects up with Charlemagne 2 weeks ago. Charlemagne, Carolingian. He writes the works of Carol, the Opus Caroli, and he actually argues for a third way. If you want Theodulf's stance, he argues for a third way between the Pope and Leo. Right? Leo says icons are bad. The Pope says no, they're great. Theodulf says no. We need a third way. We need a new way. Now, why would he do that? He got a bad Latin translation from some of the Greek guys. And Charlemagne reads it, Theodulf reads it, and they say, these Greeks are idiots. This council they just had, where they were against icons, that's awful. And the other issue, he hates the Pope because Charlemagne's not a fan of the current Pope. So a lot of politics get wrapped up in this thing. And Theodulf says, Charlemagne tells him, look, Theo, I need you to write something for me that will put us on the map, that will put the Carolingian Empire on the map, make us important, make us better than Rome and better than those Greeks over there, the weird Greeks in the East. And so Theo had to say, look, all right, how do I do this? He goes to the tradition. This is why I bring this up, because Theodulf, in his third way, focuses heavily on the tradition. He has to go back to the ancient church fathers, and he has to say, what did they argue? He has to attack the current pope. He attacks the current pope by going back to an older pope, Gregory the Great. So Theodulf really wants to find the authoritative view. Now the problem is, not all the church fathers said all the same things when it comes to images. But Theodulf makes a couple of arguments here. He says, first, look, icons are a huge problem because they turn your worship from God. That's similar to what we heard over in the East with those who hated icons. Second, he says, this is an interesting one. This is his kind of third way movement. He says, the saints do have real power, but not their pictures. Icons are bad, but let me give you what's really good, relics. Icons, but relics. You know why? Because relics are the actual body of the saints. Maybe. You know, you get the clothes, they actually touch the saints. These images, they're made by somebody in some studio. No. Relics are the way to go. And so that was Theodulf's main point. He said as well, look, if you get caught up in icons, you're just going to have churches kind of out-dueling each other. It's very interesting. He makes a kind of moral argument similar to what Luther might say later on. look, if you get these churches and they're all kind of painting pictures, they're all kind of trying to outdo each other, you're going to get wrapped up in money and wealth. He didn't maybe make the point that relics go the same way. You know, you try to out-relic each other. But anyway, we won't go down there. Nevertheless, it's interesting, I have here at the very bottom, that Theodulf, though he makes his argument, it's somewhat successful. Not ultimately, of course, but for his time, it's a pretty good argument. Charlemagne likes it. It sets forth the Carolingians. It's awesome. But in fact, even John Calvin himself, maybe 600 years down the road, quotes Theodulf. He quotes Theodulf, and basically he says here, and this is your handout, he quotes Theodulf quoting the Greeks. And he makes fun of the Greeks. He says, look, these Greek guys, some of them were arguing in favor of icons, but they have terrible arguments. He says, look, this guy John, the legate, said, God made man in his image, and from this he concluded we must have images. That's silly. Calvin says, so disgusting are their absurdities that I am ashamed even to mention them. You get a little flavor there of Calvin's lingo, his way of writing. He's not always mincing words sometimes. But the point is that this question about icons and images continues. And I suppose the other point for us to make here is to see the way in which they argued. I know I've mentioned that before, but the way in which they argued. And also notice the power that tradition begins to have. The power that appeals to the tradition of the church fathers begins to have. We'll cover that way down the road, but I'll bring it up here as a kind of secondary point. That arguments begin to be based upon what do the church fathers say. And how do you know that? Theodulf knew Greek. He had to know Greek. He used them. But what if you don't know Greek? What if you're just a guy who knows some Latin and that's about it? What do you do then? That's for next week. It's for next week. Any last questions for you? Donut Day. All right. I know we're hungry for donuts. So Jim, why don't you pray us out? Amen. Thank you all.